The autumn air was crisp as Jessica Bradley waited at the bus stop for her daughter Lucy to return from school. It was a routine they both cherished, these few moments of reconnection after a day apart. As the yellow school bus rounded the corner, Jessica smiled, anticipating Lucy's usual burst of energy and excitement to share her day's adventures. But when the bus doors opened and Lucy stepped out, Jessica's smile faded. Something was wrong. Lucy's normally bright eyes were downcast, her small shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. As Lucy approached, Jessica knelt down, her motherly instincts on high alert. "Hey, sweetheart," Jessica said softly, brushing a strand of Lucy's golden hair behind her ear. "How was your day?" Lucy's lower lip trembled slightly as she looked up at her mother. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And there's a man watching me at recess?" Jessica felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do you mean, honey? One of the teachers." Lucy shook her head emphatically. "No, not a teacher. He's old, and he just stands there and stares at me. Scary, Mom." As they walked home, hand in hand, Jessica's mind raced. She tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was just a grandparent picking up another child, or a new staff member Lucy didn't recognize. But the fear in her daughter's eyes told her this was something more. "Has he tried to talk to you?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No," Lucy replied, kicking at a pebble on the sidewalk. "He just watches. But Mom, he's there every day now. I don't like it." Jessica squeezed Lucy's hand reassuringly. "It's okay, sweetie. I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Maybe it's someone's grandfather or a new janitor, but I promise, I'll look into it, okay?" Lucy nodded, but Jessica could see the doubt in her eyes. As they reached their house, Jessica's mind was already formulating a plan. She'd call the school first thing in the morning, just to ease her mind and ensure everything was as it should be. That evening, as Jessica tucked Lucy into bed, she noticed how tightly her daughter clutched her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Snuggles. It was a telltale sign of Lucy's anxiety, one Jessica hadn't seen in months. "Mom?" Lucy's small voice broke the silence as Jessica was about to turn off the light. "Can you check under the bed, just to make sure?" Jessica's heart ached at the request. It had been over a year since Lucy had asked for a monster check. Whatever or whoever this man was, he had shaken Lucy's sense of security to its core. After thoroughly checking under the bed and in the closet, Jessica sat on the edge of Lucy's bed, stroking her daughter's hair. "Remember what I always tell you, Lucy. Mommy will always protect you, no matter what. You're safe here." Lucy nodded, her eyelids growing heavy. "I know, Mom. I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." As Jessica closed Lucy's bedroom door, she leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. The rational part of her brain insisted this was probably nothing, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a child's imagination. But the mother in her, the primal protector, was on high alert. She made her way downstairs, picking up her phone from the kitchen counter. Her finger hovered over the school's number in her contacts. It was too late to call now, but first thing in the morning, she'd get to the bottom of this. As she prepared for bed that night, Jessica found herself peering out the windows, checking the locks twice. Lucy's words echoed in her mind. "He's watching me." The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Jessica crawled into bed, her mind whirling with possibilities. Who was this man? Why was he watching the children, watching Lucy? As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Jessica made a silent vow. She would protect her daughter, no matter what. Tomorrow, she'd start getting answers. Little did Jessica know, the journey she was about to embark on would challenge her perceptions, test her judgment, and ultimately teach her a profound lesson about compassion and the complexities of the human heart. The next few days passed in a blur of mounting tension and worry for Jessica. Each morning, as she helped Lucy get ready for school, she could see the growing reluctance in her daughter's eyes. The usual excitement about seeing friends and learning new things had been replaced by a quiet dread that broke Jessica's heart. "Mom, "Do I have to go?" Lucy asked on Thursday morning, her voice small and pleading as she pushed her cereal around the bowl. Jessica knelt beside her daughter's chair, gently tucking a strand of hair behind Lucy's ear. "Sweetie, I know you're scared, but yes, you need to go to school. Remember, education is important. And I promise, I'm working on figuring out what's going on." Lucy nodded reluctantly, but Jessica could see the fear lingering in her eyes. As they walked to the bus stop, Lucy's hand clutched Jessica's tightly, only releasing when it was time to board the bus. The sight of her daughter's small figure climbing the bus steps, shoulders hunched and head down, made Jessica's stomach churn with worry. Throughout the day, Jessica found herself distracted, her mind constantly wandering to thoughts of Lucy. Was she okay? Was the man there again? The call she had made to the school earlier in the week had been frustratingly unproductive. The administrative assistant had assured her that all adults on school grounds were either staff or approved volunteers. But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. When Lucy returned home that afternoon, Jessica's concerns deepened. Her usually chatty daughter was quiet, responding to questions with short, mumbled answers. It wasn't until after dinner, as Jessica was helping Lucy with her homework, that the dam finally broke. "He was there again. Mom," Lucy whispered, her pencil halting mid-sentence on her math worksheet. "The man, he just stands there and stares. Why won't he stop?" Jessica pulled Lucy into a tight hug, feeling her daughter's small body tremble against her. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her own voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. Can you tell me more about him? What does he look like?" Lucy pulled back, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He's old. Older than you, Mom. He has gray hair and he always wears a dark blue shirt. And he just stands by the fence, watching. He doesn't talk to anyone, but his eyes, they follow me." The detail in Lucy's description sent a chill down Jessica's spine. This wasn't some vague fear or misunderstanding. Lucy was clearly seeing someone specific, someone who didn't belong. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her untouched cup of tea growing cold as she pondered her next move. She had called the school, she had talked to Lucy, but it wasn't enough. The man was still there, and her daughter was still afraid. Making a decision, Jessica picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Sarah. "Jess, everything okay?" Sarah's concerned voice came through the speaker. Jessica sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Not really, Sarah. It's Lucy. There's been a situation at school, and I don't know what to do." Over the next half hour, Jessica poured out the whole story. Lucy's fear, the mysterious man, the school's lackadaisical response. Sarah listened patiently, offering words of support, and, finally, a suggestion. "Jess, I think you need to go to the school yourself, see what's going on with your own eyes. If Lucy sees this man every day at recess, then you should be able to spot him too." Jessica nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "You're right, I've been thinking the same thing. I'll go tomorrow during Lucy's recess time. I need to see for myself what's happening." After hanging up, Jessica felt a mix of determination and apprehension. Tomorrow, she would get answers. Tomorrow, she would see the man who had been terrorizing her daughter. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she squashed it down. For Lucy's sake, she had to be strong. As she got ready for bed, Jessica found herself pausing at Lucy's door. Peeking in, she saw her daughter sleeping fitfully. Mr. Snuggles clutched tightly to her chest. The sight strengthened Jessica's resolve. Whatever was going on, whoever this man was, she would put a stop to it. Her daughter deserved to feel safe, to enjoy school without fear. Crawling into her own bed, Jessica's mind whirled with possibilities. What would she find tomorrow? Who was this mysterious watcher? As she drifted off into an uneasy sleep, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would change everything. Little did she know just how right she was, or how the truth would challenge everything she thought she knew about the situation. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil Jessica felt as she prepared for her visit to Lucy's school. She had told Lucy about her plan over breakfast, and the relief in her daughter's eyes had been palpable. "You'll see him." "Mom," Lucy had said, a glimmer of hope in her voice. "And then you can make him go away, right?" Jessica had nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll do everything I can, sweetheart. I promise." Now, as Jessica pulled into the school parking lot, her heart was racing. She had timed her arrival to coincide with the lunch recess, knowing this was when Lucy said the man was always present. As she walked towards the playground, she could hear the joyful shouts and laughter of children at play. It seemed so normal, so safe. How could there be something sinister lurking here? Jessica positioned herself near the school building, where she had a clear view of the entire playground and the fence surrounding it. Her eyes scanned the area, looking for anyone who matched Lucy's description. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just children playing and teachers supervising. Then, as her gaze swept along the perimeter fence, she saw him. The man stood partially obscured by a large oak tree, but there was no mistaking him for a parent or teacher. He was older, just as Lucy had described, with thinning gray hair and wearing a dark blue shirt that looked like it might be a uniform of some kind. But it was his demeanor that sent a chill down Jessica's spine. He wasn't moving, wasn't interacting with anyone. Jessica began to walk towards the man, her movements deliberate and purposeful. She was about halfway across the playground when the man's eyes suddenly met hers. For a split second, Jessica saw something flicker across his face. Surprise? Fear? Before he turned and quickly walked away, disappearing around the corner of the school building. Jessica broke into a run, determined not to lose sight of him. But by the time she reached the spot where he had been standing, he was gone. Frustrated, and more worried than ever, she turned back towards the school, her mind made up. It was time to confront the administration directly. The school's main office was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the playground. The secretary looked up as Jessica entered, a polite smile on her face. "Can I help you?" Jessica took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to speak with Principal Edwards immediately. It's urgent." Perhaps it was the tone of her voice or the look in her eyes, but the secretary didn't argue. Within minutes, Jessica found herself seated across from Principal Edwards, a man in his late 50s with a kind face and worried eyes. "Mrs. Bradley," he began, "what seems to be the problem?" Jessica leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The problem, Mr. Edwards, is that there is a man watching my daughter during recess. Every day. I've just seen him with my own eyes, and I demand to know who he is and why he's allowed on school grounds." Principal Edwards' brow furrowed in confusion. "A man watching the children, Mrs. Bradley. I can assure you that we take the safety of our students very seriously. All adults on school grounds are either staff or approved volunteers." "Then who is he?" Jessica pressed, describing the man she had seen. "He was right there by the fence, watching my daughter. When he saw me approaching, he ran away. Does that sound like the behavior of someone who's supposed to be here?" As she spoke, Jessica saw recognition dawn in the principal's eyes, followed quickly by what looked like relief. "Mrs. Bradley," he said gently, "I believe I know who you're referring to. That would be Mr. Harris, our school janitor. He's been with us for over 20 years. Jessica felt as if the wind had been knocked out of her. The janitor? But why would he be watching the children like that? Why would he run away when he saw me? Principal Edwards sighed, leaning back in his chair. Mr. Harris is, well, he's a bit of a solitary figure. He tends to keep to himself. As for why he was watching the playground, I imagine he was probably just taking a break. Janitors often use recess time to work outside, cleaning up or doing maintenance. Jessica shook her head, unconvinced. No, you don't understand. This isn't just a man doing his job. He was staring at my daughter, day after day. Lucy's been terrified to come to school because of him. This isn't right, and I won't stand for it. The principal held up his hands in a placating gesture, I understand your concern, Mrs. Bradley. I really do. How about this? Why don't I arrange a meeting between you and Mr. Harris? You can speak to him directly. Ask him any questions you have. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. Jessica hesitated. Part of her wanted to demand that Mr. Harris be fired immediately, to ensure he never came near Lucy again. But another part, the part that always tried to see the best in people, urged her to at least hear the man out. All right, she said finally. I'll meet with him, but I want you there too, Mr. Edwards. And if I'm not satisfied with his explanation, I expect action to be taken. My daughter's safety and peace of mind are not negotiable. As Jessica left the office, her mind was whirling. She had come to the school expecting to confront a dangerous stranger, only to find that the source of her daughter's fear was a longtime employee. It didn't make sense. Why would a janitor spend his time staring at young girls? What was really going on here? She knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't rest until she had answers. For Lucy's sake, and for the sake of every child at the school, she would get to the bottom of this mystery. Little did she know, the truth would be far more complex and heartbreaking than she could have ever imagined. The next day, Jessica found herself back at the school, her stomach in knots as she waited in Principal Edwards' office. They had arranged for Mr. Harris to join them after the school day had ended, ensuring that the children, including Lucy, would be safely on their way home. As Jessica sat, her fingers nervously tapping against the arm of her chair, she couldn't help but replay the events of the past week in her mind. Lucy's fear, the man by the fence, the revelation that he was a longtime employee of the school. It all seemed surreal. The door opened, and Principal Edwards entered, followed by a man Jessica immediately recognized as the figure from the playground. Up close, Mr. Harris looked even older than she had first thought. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Jessica. Mrs. Bradley, Principal Edwards began, his voice gentle but firm. This is Mr. Harris, our head custodian. Mr. Harris, this is Mrs. Bradley, Lucy's mother. Mr. Harris nodded slightly, his hands fidgeting with the brim of the worn cap he held. Ma'am, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica felt a surge of conflicting emotions. This man, who had been the source of so much fear and anxiety for Lucy, suddenly seemed small and vulnerable. But she couldn't let that deter her from getting answers. Mr. Harris, Jessica began, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to understand why you've been watching my daughter during recess. Lucy has been terrified, and I saw you myself yesterday. Can you explain your behavior? Mr. Harris's eyes widened, a look of genuine surprise crossing his weathered face. Watching? I didn't mean to scare anyone. I was just... His voice trailed off, and he looked to Principal Edwards as if seeking help. Principal Edwards cleared his throat. Mrs. Bradley, as I mentioned yesterday, Mr. Harris often works outside during recess. It's a good time to tidy up the grounds when the children are occupied. Jessica shook her head, frustration building. With all due respect, Mr. Edwards, that doesn't explain why Mr. Harris was standing still, staring at the children, at my daughter day after day, or why he ran when he saw me approaching. Mr. Harris flinched at her words, his shoulders hunching further. I'm sorry, he murmured. I didn't mean any harm. I like to watch the children play sometimes. It reminds me of... He stopped abruptly, his eyes filling with tears. Jessica felt her anger wavering, replaced by a growing sense of confusion and curiosity. There was clearly more to this story than a simple misunderstanding about a janitor's duties. Mr. Harris, she said, her voice softer now, I'm not here to accuse you. I just need to understand. My daughter has been afraid, and as her mother, I need to know why. Can you please explain why you've been watching Lucy so intently? Mr. Harris took a deep, shaky breath. He looked at Jessica, then at Principal Edwards, who nodded encouragingly. It's not just your daughter, Mrs. Bradley. I watch all the children. They remind me of happier times, you see, of when my Sarah was their age. "Sarah?" Jessica asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Mr. Harris nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "My daughter. She would have been about your Lucy's age now, if—" His voice broke, and he had to take a moment to compose himself. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of foreboding settling over her. "Would have been?" she prompted gently. Mr. Harris looked up, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it took Jessica's breath away. "Sarah passed away. Mrs. Bradley, many years ago now. She was just 8 years old." The office fell silent as the weight of Mr. Harris's words sank in. Jessica felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. All her assumptions, her fears about this man's intentions, suddenly seemed small in the face of this revelation. Principal Edwards cleared his throat, his voice gentle as he addressed Jessica. "Mr. Harris has been with our school for over 2 decades. Mrs. Bradley, he's a valued member of our staff, and we've always known about his loss. We perhaps should have been more aware of how his behavior might be perceived by others." Jessica nodded numbly, her mind racing to process this new information. She turned back to Mr. Harris, who sat with his head bowed, looking utterly defeated. "Mr. Harris," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss, but I need to understand, why Lucy? Why has she caught your attention in particular?" Mr. Harris looked up, his eyes meeting Jessica's. "Your Lucy. She looks so much like my Sarah did. The same golden hair, the same laugh. Sometimes, when I see her playing, it's like I can see Sarah again, just for a moment." Jessica felt tears prick her eyes as the full picture began to come into focus. This wasn't a story of danger or ill intent, but one of profound grief and longing. "And yesterday?" she asked. "Why did you run when you saw me coming?" Mr. Harris shook his head, a look of shame crossing his face. "I realized how it must have looked. A strange old man watching the children. I panicked. I never meant to scare anyone, least of all the little ones. They bring me so much joy, even if it's tinged with sadness." As Mr. Harris's story unfolded, Jessica felt her fear and anger melting away, replaced by a deep sense of empathy. The man before her wasn't a threat. He was a grieving father, finding solace in the innocent play of children who reminded him of what he had lost. But even as she understood, Jessica knew that the situation couldn't continue as it was. Lucy's fear was real, and other parents might react as she had if they noticed Mr. Harris's behavior. Taking a deep breath, Jessica leaned forward. "Mr. Harris, I understand now, and I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through. But you must understand how your actions have affected my daughter and potentially other children. We need to find a way to address this that respects your grief, but also ensures the children feel safe." Principal Edwards nodded in agreement. "Mrs. Bradley is right. John, I think it's time we revisited your duties and found a way for you to continue your valuable work here without causing any unintended discomfort." As the 3 adults began to discuss possible solutions, Jessica felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The mystery was solved, the threat non-existent. But, in its place was a new challenge: how to balance compassion for a grieving man with the need to protect and reassure the children. Little did Jessica know, this conversation was just the beginning of a journey that would not only resolve Lucy's fears, but also bring healing to a man who had been silently suffering for years. As the meeting in Principal Edwards' office continued, Jessica found herself on an emotional roller coaster. The fear and anger that had driven her to confront Mr. Harris had been replaced by a profound sense of sadness and empathy. The story that unfolded before her was far more heartbreaking than anything she could have imagined. "Mr. Harris," Jessica said gently, "can you tell me more about Sarah? It might help me understand better." Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes misting over with tears. "Sarah she was my whole world, Mrs. Bradley. Smart as a whip, and kind to everyone she met. She had this laugh that could light up a room." He paused, a small smile playing on his lips at the memory. "She loved school, loved learning. That's why I started working here, after we lost her. It felt like a way to stay connected to her. Jessica felt her own eyes welling up. How did she pass away, if you don't mind me asking? Mr. Harris took a shaky breath. It was a car accident. One rainy afternoon, just like any other. My wife was driving Sarah home from her piano lesson when a truck lost control on the wet road. Sarah was gone instantly. My wife, she held on for a few days in the hospital, but in the end, I lost them both. The office fell silent as the weight of Mr. Harris's words settled over them. Jessica's heart ached for this man who had endured such unimaginable loss. I'm so sorry, she whispered, reaching out to pat Mr. Harris's hand gently. I can't even imagine the pain you've been through. Mr. Harris nodded, wiping his eyes with a weathered hand. It was a long time ago now, but some days it feels like yesterday. Seeing the children here, especially ones like your Lucy who remind me so much of Sarah, it's both a blessing and a curse. It brings back the joy of those happy times, but also the pain of what I've lost. Principal Edwards, who had been listening silently, spoke up. John, why didn't you ever tell me how much this was affecting you? We could have worked something out, found a way to make things easier for you. Mr. Harris shrugged, a look of shame crossing his face. I didn't want to be a bother, and I was afraid that if people knew, they might think I was unfit to work here. This job, being around the children, it's all I have left of Sarah in a way. Jessica felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had been so quick to assume the worst, to see Mr. Harris as a threat. But sitting here now, listening to his story, all she could see was a deeply wounded man who had found a small measure of comfort in the presence of happy, thriving children. Mr. Harris, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I owe you an apology. I jumped to conclusions without understanding the full story. But I hope you can understand why Lucy was frightened. From her perspective, and mine when I first saw you, it seemed like something sinister was happening. Mr. Harris nodded vigorously. Oh, of course, Mrs. Bradley. I never meant to scare anyone. I get lost in my memories sometimes. I should have been more aware of how my behavior might look to others. Principal Edwards leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. I think we all share some responsibility here. John, we should have been more attentive to your needs and the potential impact of your grief on your work. Mrs. Bradley, your concerns were valid, and I'm glad you brought them to our attention. Now, the question is, how do we move forward from here? Jessica thought for a moment, an idea forming. Mr. Harris, would you be willing to share your story with the children? Not all the details, of course, but enough for them to understand why you sometimes watch them play. It might help alleviate their fears and teach them about empathy and grief at the same time. Mr. Harris looked surprised, then thoughtful. I've never considered that. Do you think it would help? Principal Edwards nodded enthusiastically. I think it's an excellent idea. We could incorporate it into our character education program. John, your story could be incredibly powerful in teaching our students about resilience and the importance of compassion. As they continued to discuss the possibilities, Jessica felt a sense of hope blooming. What had started as a terrifying situation was transforming into an opportunity for healing and education. She thought of Lucy, imagining how her daughter might react to learning Mr. Harris's story. Would she be able to move past her fear and see the grieving father behind the silent watcher? By the time the meeting concluded, a plan had been put in place. Mr. Harris would share his story in an assembly, with support from the school counselor. His duties would be adjusted to minimize unsupervised time around the playground, not out of suspicion, but to ensure everyone's comfort. And Jessica had promised to speak with Lucy, to help her understand the truth behind the man who had been watching her. As they stood to leave, Mr. Harris turned to Jessica, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mrs. Bradley, thank you for listening, for understanding. I never meant to cause any trouble, but I'm grateful for the chance to make things right. Jessica smiled, reaching out to shake his hand. Thank you for sharing your story, Mr. Harris. I think we've all learned an important lesson today about not jumping to conclusions and the power of open communication. As Jessica left the school, her mind was whirling with everything she had learned. The man she had feared, the figure that had terrified her daughter, was not a threat, but a heartbroken father seeking solace in the joy of children. It was a powerful reminder that behind every strange behavior, every misunderstood action, there could be a deeply human story waiting to be heard. Now, she faced the challenge of explaining all of this to Lucy. How would her daughter react? Would she be able to see past her fear and understand Mr. Harris's pain? As Jessica drove home, she began to formulate the words she would use, hoping to turn this experience into a valuable lesson about empathy, understanding, and the complex nature of human emotions. How could she help her 8-year-old daughter understand the depths of grief and longing that had driven the old janitor's actions? Pulling into the driveway, Jessica took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. She found Lucy in her room, coloring at her small desk. Mr. Snuggles propped up beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," Jessica said softly, sitting on Lucy's bed. "Can we talk for a minute?" Lucy looked up, her eyes wary. "Is it about the man at school? Did you make him go away?" Jessica patted the spot next to her, and Lucy came to sit, clutching Mr. Snuggles tightly. "Well, it is about the man at school, but it's not quite what we thought. His name is Mr. Harris, and he's actually the school janitor." Lucy's brow furrowed in confusion. "But why was he always watching me?" "It was scary, Mom." Jessica nodded, putting an arm around her daughter. "I know it was, sweetie, and I'm so proud of you for telling me about it. But there's something very sad about Mr. Harris that I need to explain to you." Over the next few minutes, Jessica carefully related Mr. Harris's story, simplifying the tragedy but ensuring Lucy understood the core of his pain. She watched as her daughter's expression changed from fear to surprise, and then to a dawning compassion that made Jessica's heart swell with pride. "So, he was watching because I reminded him of Sarah?" Lucy asked, her voice small. Jessica nodded. "That's right. He didn't mean to scare you. He was just lost in his memories of his own little girl." Lucy was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she looked up at Jessica, her eyes shining. "That's so sad, Mom. Poor Mr. Harris. Do you think it would be okay if I said hi to him sometimes? Maybe it would make him feel better." Tears pricked Jessica's eyes at her daughter's kindness. "Oh, Lucy, I think that would be wonderful, but only if you feel comfortable, okay? Your feelings matter too." Lucy nodded solemnly. "I think I'd like to. Maybe we could even bring him cookies sometime. Sarah probably used to make cookies with him, right?" Jessica hugged Lucy tightly, marveling at her daughter's capacity for empathy. "That's a lovely idea. Sweetheart, we'll definitely do that." As they sat there, Jessica realized that this experience, as frightening as it had been, had opened up an opportunity to teach Lucy about the complexities of human emotions and the importance of not jumping to conclusions. "You know, Lucy," Jessica said softly, "this whole situation has taught me something important. Sometimes, things that seem scary at first might have a very different explanation if we take the time to understand. It's always important to be safe and tell a grown-up if something worries you. But it's also good to remember that people's actions might have reasons we don't understand at first." Lucy nodded thoughtfully. "Like how Mr. Harris wasn't being scary on purpose. He was just really sad." "Exactly," Jessica smiled. "And look how brave you were to tell me about it. Because you did, we were able to help Mr. Harris and make the school a better place for everyone." As Lucy snuggled closer, Jessica felt a profound sense of gratitude. What had started as a terrifying ordeal had transformed into a powerful lesson in empathy, understanding, and the healing power of compassion. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Oakwood Elementary School. True to their word, Principal Edwards and Mr. Harris organized an assembly to address the students. With the support of the school counselor, Mr. Harris shared a simplified version of his story, explaining why he sometimes watched the children at play. Jessica attended the assembly with Lucy, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her daughter listen intently, her small hand occasionally reaching out to pat Mr. Harris's arm when his voice wavered with emotion. After the assembly, many children, led by Lucy, approached Mr. Harris with words of comfort and even hugs. The fear that had once surrounded the old janitor dissipated, replaced by a wave of childish empathy that brought tears to the eyes of many watching adults. In the days that followed, Jessica noticed a change in the school atmosphere. Children would wave to Mr. Harris in the hallways, and some even started helping him with small tasks like picking up litter in the schoolyard. The once solitary figure became an integral part of the school community. Lucy, true to her word, insisted on baking cookies to share with Mr. Harris. It became a weekly tradition, with Lucy proudly presenting a small package of homemade treats every Friday afternoon. These simple acts of kindness seemed to breathe new life into the old man, and Jessica often caught sight of him smiling, a rare occurrence before. The school administration, inspired by the events, implemented new programs focused on emotional intelligence and empathy. They brought in grief counselors to work not just with Mr. Harris, but with any staff or students who were dealing with loss. One sunny afternoon, about a month after the assembly, Jessica arrived at the school to pick up Lucy and found her daughter engrossed in conversation with Mr. Harris. As she approached, she heard Lucy's clear voice floating across the schoolyard. And then, what happened? Mr. Harris. Did Sarah like the puppet show? Mr. Harris chuckled, a sound that Jessica realized she had never heard before. Oh, she loved it, Lucy. Laughed so hard she got hiccups. You remind me of her so much when you laugh. Lucy beamed at him. I'm glad you can remember happy things about Sarah now, Mr. Harris. Mom says it's good to remember the happy times when we're sad. Jessica felt her heart swell as she watched this interaction. The fear that had once defined Lucy's relationship with Mr. Harris had been replaced by a friendship that seemed to be healing both of them. Hello, you two, Jessica said as she reached them. Having a good chat? Mr. Harris stood, tipping his cap to Jessica. Mrs. Bradley, your Lucy here is a ray of sunshine. Thank you, both of you, for everything. As they said their goodbyes and headed home, Lucy chatted animatedly about the stories Mr. Harris had shared. Jessica listened, marveling at how drastically things had changed in just a few short weeks. That evening, as she tucked Lucy into bed, it was a powerful example of looking beyond first impressions and the importance of empathy. For Jessica, it was a reminder not to let fear cloud her judgment and the transformative power of compassion. The terrifying figure in the schoolyard had turned out to be a catalyst for positive change, bringing a community together and fostering understanding. As Jessica closed Lucy's door, she felt grateful for the unexpected journey they had been on, a journey that had turned fear into friendship and misunderstanding into a powerful lesson in human connection. In the quiet of the evening, Jessica made a silent promise to herself. She would carry this experience with her, always striving to look deeper, to understand before judging, and to approach the world with an open heart. For in doing so, she realized, we not only make the world a better place for others, but also enrich our own lives in profound and unexpected ways. The man in the schoolyard was no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of the complex tapestry of human emotions and the healing power of compassion. And in that transformation lay the true beauty of their story, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unifying force of understanding.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.